And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to today's CaptureCast, where we are going to explore how to get your admissions team ready for the successful 2024 season. I'm Chris Harris, Senior Enrollment Strategist here at Capture Higher Ed, and on behalf of our entire marketing team, welcome to today's live broadcast. As always, if you have questions, please leave them in the comments area, and if we have time at the end of today's presentation, we'll answer them live. If we don't, I'll email you back either later today or tomorrow. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're looking for some specific answers, right? We're looking for, what are some effective communication techniques that admissions counselors can use to build strong relationships with prospective students? Two, how can we leverage that data and all the analytics that's out there? What an explosion we've had in the last 4 or 5 years, and the amount of data and analytics that we have out there for our admissions counselors, but sometimes they can get lost in it. So how can we leverage that data to help them make better informed decisions about implementing their recruitment strategies? Three, how can admissions counselors adapt their approach to different students and parent preferences for communication? A lot of communication, different strategies that are out there right now. How can we help them adapt to their approach on the fly during the year, right? So what are some strategies for counselors as they build the collaborative partnerships on campus? We're going to talk about, reaching across and talking to faculty and to other staff members about helping out with the recruitment process. And finally, how can leadership and counselors prioritize self-care and professional development in a demanding admissions environment? We're going to talk about how you can take care of yourself and make sure that your team, if you're an enrollment leader, is doing the right stuff. So for those of you who are new to the CaptureCast, welcome. We are glad that you're here. For more than 12 years, Capture Higher Ed has been a leading recruitment marketing company serving the higher education sector. Our mission is simple. We help institutions identify, convert, and enroll the right students for your campus. We do our work by leveraging the industry's only behavioral intelligence platform that features the industry's most reliable and accurate predictive models, apply, and enroll. And our team of experts who design and execute the best recruitment marketing strategies that are tailored to meet your needs. We are a totally managed service that walks alongside with our partners and every day to ensure that you not only reach your goals, but that you understand how we got through those goals through transparency and efficiency. So today we're going to cover some simple things: empowering your admissions counselors. How do you build that team? Effective communication techniques, using data smartly, adapting to changing preferences, and building that collaboration, and of course, counselor self-care and professional development. So as always, Emma, we're going to get ready, and Emma is in Louisville at HQ. And she's the one that's helping us run today's event. But we're gonna have a little poll question, as we always do. So tell me, how much turnover has your admissions team had in the past year? I know that when I was looking at it, and we'll talk a little bit about it here in a little bit, but I think I saw about 3,000 open positions in admissions in financial aid right now, and marketing as well. And that was on higheredjobs.com. No, I wasn't looking for a new job, but I was just trying to get some backstory on that. So right now is a big hiring time. We got all new budgets in July, remember, and we're replacing people and things like that. So, but how much turnover have you had in the past year? I was going to make this over the last 2 years, but I didn't want everybody to get depressed about it. So Emma, go ahead and let's go ahead and pop the answers up. So about 36%, 21 to 40%. 30%, 41 to 60%. That's a lot, folks. There's a lot of turnover out there. And I think one of the reasons why is and we'll get into this with our special guest here in a moment, but I think a lot of it has to do with nobody goes to college to be an admissions counselor. They're not prepared for it, and we're not doing a really good job of moving it. So let's bring in our special guest today. And I'd like to bring in our special guest for our CaptureCast today, Jeremy Tiers. Jeremy's going to pop in 3, 2, 1. There he is, live and in charge. Jeremy is the Senior Director at Tudor Collegiate Strategies and is the host of the most popular Mission Admissions podcast. Jeremy, thanks for taking the time out of your crazy schedule. I know you were on a plane yesterday and you were on a plane Monday and you're all over the place. So just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you engage with at Tudor Collegiate Strategies.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on, Chris. As we were sharing before We jumped on with everybody else here. It is absolutely hot and sticky where I am, which is in Indianapolis. That's my HQ. And so it is very, very warm and unseasonably high humidity to today. I spent my morning as a parent of a soon-to-be eighth grader, taking my daughter along with my wife to pick up her schedule. School starts here next week. My daughter could not be more excited to be in eighth grade, and I am excited as a parent to go through some of this college search process in the next few years. So that will definitely be interesting. But at Tudor, I lead and run our admissions and enrollment management division. Tudor kind of has two divisions. The way I explain it to people, we have a whole separate arm of the company that works with college athletic departments and coaches and does the exact same thing that I do and that other people do on the admissions and enrollment side, which is staff training, which is where I was earlier this week in Birmingham, Alabama. Why Chris mentioned I was on planes. And then we also do communication work. And so much of what we do at Tudor that excites me, because I'm going to share a lot of it today with the audience, is everything is backed by data. There's not one thing that any of us talk about at TCS that we don't have strong data from different groups of students or parents around.
That's awesome. So as we get started today, your work really leads me to think about how the admissions team can be empowered as a group or as an individual. I was thinking back to, I spent my 26 years on a campus helping identify and onboard new folks onto our teams. And it was always kind of like this musical group. Like I always kind of liken it to Boys to Men, right? So you had five or six individuals who all had a very different sound, right? They all had a different sound. When you bring them together, it's wonderful to hear. But I'm sure they fought a little bit. I'm sure that they threw things at each other, they yelled at each other over the years, but they've maintained this amazing group. And I kind of liken it to that perspective. And my question for you, Jeremy, based upon your thousands of interactions with admissions teams across the country, how does empowering the counselors to build those important relationships impact the overall success of a campaign? How important is it to have that team building piece in place?
Super uber important, Chris. It might be one of the most important things that right now needs to, again, have more attention in enrollment management and admissions offices, meaning if you empower your team with the right tools on how to build relationships, which we can talk more about in a minute, it becomes so much easier for them to deliver a better experience. And that's what, I know higher ed doesn't like to hear it, but that's what higher ed needs to understand, right? You are, in some regard, in a sales type environment, and that's not a bad thing, right? You're selling a student experience, and what this generation wants to understand is, number one, why should I want to go to college? Number two, why should I choose your school over these other options I have if I have other options? And three, how can you help me, you being an entire college or university, to achieve whatever goals ultimately I want to achieve? And so the data is very clear, Chris, that when admissions counselors specifically are empowered and have the right training and have the right tools, that relationships 100% recruit and retain students. People influence other people, Chris, as you know, and you and I have talked about this before offline. We all make decisions based on how we feel, right? Sure. I'm not going to do something if I don't feel comfortable. I'm not going to let my daughter in 4 years, when she goes through this college search process, go somewhere, I promise you, that I don't think she's going to be taken care of and that I feel comfortable letting her go to. And I'm sure my wife will have the same sentiment. So I think one of the biggest things that schools need to do more, Chris, is show their admissions team through things like data, back to data and how important it is, right? We do different surveys, for example, every time I go work with a school. So the school I was at in Alabama earlier this week, the school I was at in Arkansas last week, both times before I went in and worked with those admissions and enrollment teams, we surveyed their incoming first-year students who will start at those schools here in the next couple of weeks. And one of the three most important things on both those surveys, and it's been in the top 3 to 4, literally, Chris, on 100% of surveys in the 10 years I've been doing this, when it comes to, hey, what was really important? This is what we asked students in the survey. what was really important when you made your college decision? Like rank all of these things. 10, super important. 1, yeah, I didn't even think about it. How the admission staff treated them throughout the process, 100% is in the top 3 or 4 of every single survey. And it was number 1 on one of the 2 surveys last week, all right, at the school I was at in Arkansas. And it was number 2 on the other survey at the other school I was at in Alabama. And at the end of the day, not only showing the staff that so they understand the value when they're building relationships the right way, but I would say take it even a step further, which is something we've started to do at TCS this year that we weren't doing previously. On those same surveys, Chris, we also have an open-ended question that says, talk to us about your experiences with the admissions staff. Like, give us as much detail as you're comfortable sharing. And Chris, I'll take the school in Arkansas, for example, I was at last week. Verbatim, I had multiple students in this anonymous survey saying, I am not choosing this school if it wasn't for my admissions counselor. Verbatim. And they're not just saying my admissions counselor, they're mentioning the admissions counselor by name first and last name.
Sure.
And so for that to happen, which we'd love to believe happens on every campus, we know it doesn't, that admissions counselor had to make a major impact on that student and family. And I think being able to show your staff that and getting them to understand, this is the chance you have every single time you reach out in some medium of communication or you're in front of a student every single day, is to make an impact at a critical point in their life. And showing that data can be super motivating for a team.
I think it's interesting. I always, as a communication major, I learned early on, I think it was in speech class 101 with Dr. Dixon. I think he said, they're going to remember 13% of everything you say, but what they're really going to remember is how they made you, how you made them feel. So, you can get up and do your song and dance, and you can have those long conversations with people, but what they're really going to remember is how you made them feel when you met with them. So why are we really here? I mean, I think, we're still kind of dealing with the pandemic. And like I said before, there's a ton of, like I said, about 3,000 positions in admissions and marketing across the nation right now, at least what's been posted anyway to see. I think, it's an interesting time right now because we're starting to see more people go back into the job market right now between the ages of 25 and 54. That was up again this past quarter, according to some Bloomberg statistics I was looking at. But still, to this day, 73% of people want to still do remote work. Half of them are still feeling burned out, and they're resigning because of low pay. I think we can all agree that admissions counselors don't get paid a ton of money for the amount of responsibility that they have. I won't even tell you how much I made when I first started back in the 90s. It was depressing, actually, when I thought about it the other day. But if you think about it, we're about 45 days away from getting out there and traveling again. And we have this great number of people that we need to hire and get into positions. So, and I think the other part is that we don't do we don't do a great deal of succession planning on college campuses. We do it for presidents and we do it for vice presidents for academic affairs. But when it comes to succession planning for the enrollment management division, do they have those directors that are ready to step into those vice presidents' jobs? Do you have those associate directors who have longevity, who have an understanding of data and relationships to build those bridges? We're still seeing those gaps of leadership that are out there. So, Jeremy, I think when you were looking at what's going on, your background in coaching is interesting to me because, having been a former student athlete myself, team chemistry and focus are always at the forefront of a successful team. What kind of pointers do you have for those hiring managers who might be watching us today or catching us later on? For what are some solid hiring practices that help our colleagues make better decisions about who they hire?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that's important to understand is the people you're going to hire are not all part of the same generation. Okay. And I was on a campus last summer and I remember a VP who was in his 60s at the time saying to me, Jeremy, how come I can't get like this group of people on my staff to do the same thing in the same way as these people? And I'm like, because one's in their 20s and one's in like their 40s or 50s. And I'm like, they're from different generations, which isn't right or wrong, but it means you have to adapt and adjust based on, for example, who you're hiring and when you're hiring. And so For me, when I get that question, which I get a lot, Chris, from directors, AVPs, and VPs, hey, Jeremy, like thoughts on if I have to hire a bunch of staff, what I should be looking for. I always tell people, focus on finding candidates who possess skills that are really hard to teach. Like it's really hard to teach somebody, Chris, to be empathetic if they're not just naturally empathetic, right? Are they a good listener? Are they kind? Are they curious? Are they self-motivated and determined? I'm not saying you can't be taught some of those things, but those are a lot harder to teach, for example, than what it means to be an admissions counselor and hear all the things that we want you to talk about as they relate to whatever school might be doing the hiring. And so all of those things and just the the character of a person, I think are super important. And I tell people, sure, if a candidate happens to be internal and was a tour guide, for example, or a student ambassador and has all those things, awesome. But I think I'm finding too many schools, Chris, saying, well, we have to hire somebody who like knows the school. No, I would argue you really don't. In fact, you can have somebody who understands every single fact and figure and nook and cranny of your school. But if they can't do some of those, what I would call soft skills that I just mentioned, it's going to be really, really, really hard for them, as you know, to build effective relationships that ultimately get students to do the different things in this process that college admissions offices want them to do. And the other thing I also mentioned, Chris, that I see, it's part of the reason, if I'm being honest, why I'm so busy throughout the year, is the onboarding plan at most colleges. And you mentioned this earlier, right? Or succession planning. It's not what it needs to be if we're being honest with each other in 2023. We all know how important it is if you're listening and you're in a leadership position. Like, I'm not worried about that. So then why don't we have better structure and better training? And by training, I don't mean you hand somebody a big binder, right? Which schools still do in 2023, that has every fact and figure about the school and says, go talk to your neighbor, you'll figure it out. That's not a good onboarding plan. And obviously I'm generalizing there, but you have to teach your staff, depending on their skill level, going back to what I said before, because some will need more, some will need less, things like, how do you understand how to start talking to a 17-year-old, for example, in 2023? And how do you talk to somebody who's a parent in 2023? And do you understand that asking, do you have any questions, is the absolute worst question you can ever ask working in an admissions office, because it's too open-ended and students don't know what they're supposed to say, nor do a lot of parents. So you have to be more direct and intentional. It's teaching staffs when you onboard them, Chris, things like that not only set them up for success, but get them more excited about their job, because then they find that they have better conversations with students.
I think that's interesting. You say the soft skills. I remember when I was working in Ohio, I was working with some faculty members who were recruiting for the physical therapy department, and they were talking about they have an interview that you have to go through, right? Because you have only so many spots, and you have 700 people apply for these positions in your school, and they were saying, these kids are great, 34, 35 ACTs, and they've never had a B in their life, but they can't hold a conversation with anybody. So there's that book smart, there's this tenacity of learning that's happened, but we've kind of gotten away from those soft skills a lot of times, and finding those people who are the mix of those things is a big deal. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So when we talk about effective communication techniques, that's kind of where we are. Here's an example of one, and how many different times that you would be able to, or a prospective student might have that interaction with you or your team on campus. From the time that you purchase their SAT or their ACT name, or whether you use Niche or one of the other vendors out there, you are sending emails and you're making phone calls and you're having this comm flow, and you have, travel and all these other things that go along with that. But are you having meaningful, I guess is the word I'm looking for, meaningful conversations and meaningful contact with these people? Again, you want to have a full integrated setup for communication so that you're hitting all the different pieces. But at the same time, it doesn't mean anything unless you're getting meaningful contact with those people and being able to interact with them where they are, when they want to do it, kind of situation. So Jeremy, as an expert from working with many different campuses, what communication techniques do you find most effective in building those strong relationships, not with just prospective students, but also within the team themselves? Because nowadays we do have remote folks all over the United States. There's small private schools that are hiring people to go work in different states and kind of thing as they expand their territory management. What kind of real communication techniques are you seeing that are working most effectively?
Number one, I would tell you, Chris, is being an active listener has never been more important. And that's a skill, myself included, right? That you have to practice and you have to learn for most of the population. And that's okay. To truly be an active listener, though, completely separates the level of conversation you can have with somebody. And then it also helps with the level of responsiveness you can give. And so, for example, there's something called competitive listening, which I'm sure a number of people in the audience have heard, but if some of you haven't, competitive listening is if I'm having a conversation with you, you're kind of listening to me, but you're not really listening to me because you're thinking in your brain, all right, when Jeremy stops talking, I'm either going to push back because I disagree with what he's saying or I don't like it, or I'm more worried about like how I'm going to respond than actually hearing what Jeremy's saying, which then the way our brains work, you're going to miss things that I say. And I would argue it makes it harder for you to truly then potentially serve my needs or deliver a better experience. And so teaching staff, for example, Chris, how to actively listen and take information then. So we'll just play it out in a scenario. Chris is a prospective student. I'm his admissions counselor. If I ask Chris a question and Chris gives me feedback and I'm actively listening, when Chris stops, even if it takes me 3, 4, 5 seconds of a pause before I answer, which is totally okay, by the way, if I go back to Chris and then say, okay, now based on what Chris just told me, here's what I'm going to share about our student experience, or here's something else it's going to feel way more personal and relevant in terms of the reception Chris is going to feel than it is if I just start vomiting information because I really didn't listen to what Chris was saying. That's a completely unique technique that the better you get at it as an admissions counselor, the better you can serve students. And then the other big thing, Chris, that ties in with that is just understanding, and this is the biggest game changer when I do trainings, Chris, that people tell me after the fact. I saw Nicole asked in the chat, one of the listeners, hey, are you able to share, Jeremy, what did that admissions counselor do to like really impress the student in the survey that said like, this is why I'm going to the school? And one of the things that was mentioned, Nicole and everybody listening in the survey was the admissions counselor just listened to my needs and then gave me information that I felt like mattered to me. And that seems so basic, but because of the volume that higher ed deals with, there's not enough personalization and segmentation and relevance happening when it comes to in-person or even nonverbal communication by admission staff. So understanding, for example, how do I ask an effective question? Well, it's not asking, as I said earlier, do you have any questions? Because students are like, of course I have questions, but I don't know what I'm supposed to ask. I don't want to say something that sounds silly. So it's easier for me to say, no, I think I'm okay, or no, I'm good. Asking a direct question leads to a whole different level of conversation. And I'll give you an example, literally that happened to me about 2 hours ago. I'm going through my inbox, cleaning up my emails, and I got an email this morning from an admissions counselor at a school in Wisconsin, not a school we've ever partnered with before, but I'm sure some of you listening might be a part of my newsletter list that I send out every Tuesday. And this admissions counselor happens to be on that list. And she said, Jeremy, I've been reading for a year. I've been trying to do some of the stuff you mentioned there. And I just wanted to share some of the success that's happened to me in the last week. And what she basically said is, I send all of my top inquiries, who will be high school seniors here this fall, literally a text message where and I had to write it down in the text message she said was, if Chris was getting the text message, hey, Chris, how are you feeling about your college search? Literally, that was the entire. Sure. And she said she sent that to over 300 inquiries. She got 75 of them to respond. She ended up spending 3 hours going back and forth, which she wasn't planning on doing, but having follow-up conversation. And she said of those 75 that responded, about 30 of them or so, she literally had multiple text exchanges back and forth to where people at the end were saying, I just appreciate the fact that you're asking me and trying to learn about what I'm struggling with and how you might be able to help. And so the more that admissions counselors can ask the right questions, can understand how to do things like lead the conversation, but again, not vomit information, and then ultimately actively listen and then give information about their school, the deeper a relationship and more effective communication technique that is, Chris.
I think the other part too, and you bring up a really good point. just vomiting that information out there. It used to be, when I first started admissions, we would literally buy 1 million names and we would send out 500,000 search pieces, and then we would just do this mass volume kind of situation. We, plug the top of the funnel, and it would all come down, and we'd end up working, more applications than we probably needed to be working, and things like that. Where the message was the same to everybody, and that's not the expectation anymore. Gen Z and even their parents now are starting to feel that to your point, that personalization is a big deal. And how do we get that segmented effect in place? And it kind of goes back to data, right? And when we talk about data, there's so much data out there now. We can measure everything now. We can measure, obviously we have a ton of sources that we get enough information from. And then we serve out ads, or we send out emails, or we send text messages, or we send snail mail, those kinds of things. But now, there are products like what we have here at Capture, our Engage platform can actually look at student behavior when they're interacting with your digital platform material, whether they're interacting with an ad or opening an email or visiting your website. I know who's on a website, how long they're on the website, what places that they're going every time they go, and I score that. Not only do we score it for a week, but we'll score it over the lifetime, right? So you're talking about building relationships over time. I'm talking about building relationships, over 4 or 5 years. I mean, Jeremy, somebody's going to start recruiting your daughter this year. It's going to happen, right? So, I'll give out your home address here in a little bit for everybody to start sending view books to your house. But data drives everything that we do every day. And the use of that data can really focus your counselor's efforts into creating those personalized communications on a day-to-day basis. Being able to see what students are interested in, and looking at where then you can put your resources. And I think that's the other part too. When we look at your marketing spend versus how much your counselor are doing outreach, and that's what we're kind of really focused in on that right now. But the biggest resource we have that we use every year is our counselors. And we abuse, and I will say that I am guilty. I was abused as a counselor. I just loved making phone calls until 10 o'clock at night, 4 or 5 nights a week, and coming in on Saturdays. And we have all these ways of communicating now, whether, it's through, a text message or an email, and we can do it automated through our CRMs now. But it's that personalization piece that you're missing a lot of times, that people can see through, right? But they're expecting to be marketed to. But for the college search process, it needs to be taken one step further beyond okay, here is the information for X college or university. Okay, that's the basis of it, but what's it mean to me? That kind of thing. When it comes to data, Jeremy, there are so many variables out there now. I mean, literally, the catalog is huge. What are some of the more critical data points that you're seeing with your research and working with counselors so that they know what they should be considering when creating those individual recruitment strategies?
I think it could be done a couple of different ways, Chris, right? And campuses I'm on, when I'm working with schools that we partner with, not everybody's doing it the same way. So the 2 most popular ways are somebody who's in the CRM daily, whether it's somebody on the enrollment marketing team or a CRM specialist, whatever that person might be called, that's within the admissions team there, is actually going through and prioritizing the lists and then literally handing them to the counselors each week. And then there are other schools that do it the opposite way and really work hard to train their counselors to go into Slate, to go into, whatever the platform might be that you have for your CRM, and understand how to look at things like the timeline, how to look at things like the notes section. And for example, be able to say, okay, I haven't talked with Jeremy in about a week. It's been a positive interaction and he's done A, B, C, and D, because I can see that right through the metrics I have. I need to reach out to him. And so I think the first thing for any leaders listening is, what is the expectation, and is it clear for your staff on how they're going to find this data and or mine this data? Because Chris, I think you'll admit it, right? Like, yes, Slate is everybody's favorite CRM, if we're being honest. The problem with Slate, as I always joke, is Slate will do everything you want and more. The problem is they keep introducing new things that just when you think you understand Slate, yeah, you don't understand Slate anymore. And so trying to do one training a year, for example, with a CRM, I would argue that's unrealistic for you to think your staff, and you made this point earlier, Chris, right? Where you said something along the lines of, hey, you're not going to remember when you gave that person an example, half the stuff that was said. Yeah, your staff is not going to remember, for example, when they do any training, whether it's with me, whether it's with somebody internally, a good chunk of what is said. And so there has to be more intentional follow-up. So just the first thing I would say for leadership, just making it clear, does your staff know how they're supposed to go find this data? And if the answer is we give it to them, great. Then you've got that part taken care of. Then I think it's understanding, well, what else is being done behind the scenes? Meaning most college admissions offices have somebody on the admissions team or on the enrollment marketing team who is writing, and by writing, I mean writing emails, not necessarily handwritten things, but is sending emails, is sending text messages to large different segments of the population. I'm amazed, Chris, at the number of schools I go to where I'm like, I've got 30 people in front of me, admissions, enrollment marketing, sometimes financial aid. Put up your hand if you know what goes out each week to your prospective students, and hardly anybody puts up their hand, Chris. That's an easy, and that's an easy fix though, right? Which is why I'm mentioning it. Because if you're, again, a leader listening to this, or if you're an admissions counselor and you're going, yep, Jeremy, I have no clue what people on my campus send. I highly encourage you need to go ask. And if you're a leader, you need to make sure your staff knows, because it also will help them say, okay, I want to make sure I don't send Chris an email 7 minutes after he got an email, right, from somebody else on our campus. Or what if that email was written with Chris's name on it and appearing to be coming from, me or whoever it was, and now that person gets 2 emails from you in a matter of 7 minutes. Right. So when you're trying to prioritize outreach, those are things that really don't get talked about a lot, and that I think you need to do double checks on, or you need to make sure those systems are in place. Then I think it's, all right, do you know when you should be reaching out if you're a counselor? Like, we'll talk about what metrics can help you prioritize in a sec, but do you know when you should be reaching out? Like, for example, when a student signs up for a campus visit, if it's your student, do you actually reach out, or do you just let all the automated communications do all the outreach for you? Because those automated communications on most campuses, and I know because we do comm audits, 98% of them aren't very personal, and all they do is vomit information about the upcoming visit. Literally a simple text or a simple email coming from the counselor expressing excitement that the student is coming to visit, and then saying some call to action question, for example, of, Jeremy, what are you most excited to see when you come to campus next week? I think that is way undervalued, and yet again is another touch point that allows you to differentiate and learn something about a student and start to develop or continue to develop a deeper relationship. If a student is going to respond to an email or respond to a text message at any point in this process, that's a major metric, Chris. You talked about metrics earlier, that is so underrated. Engagement is so underrated. Not just engagement of, you mentioned some key ones earlier. Are they on the website? Where are they looking? How much time? Yes, all of those are important. But if somebody's actually going to take the time to respond to an email or respond to a text message, especially if it's a young person in high school, they're not doing that with every school, even if the other schools are asking them to, I promise you. That's a metric, for example, that admissions counselors should 100% be utilizing a lot more than they are. Other metrics I would tell you to be thinking about, and some of these I'm sure your audience is already doing. Are you prioritizing students who have visited campus over those who haven't? Meaning, I want you to make sure you're reaching out to all of them, but I'm also well aware you don't have enough hours in the day as an individual counselor to reach out to every inquiry or every admitted student when you get to that group. And so saying, all right, I also need to look at who has done other things to demonstrate that they want to learn more or they're interested. And it's not just who has responded to an email. Well, who's also visited campus? And who did I meet when I was on the road this fall at a college fair or a high school, and I had a good conversation with him or her? And whose parents have I actually connected with, or they've connected with me? And is that student being recruited by one of our athletic teams? Because that matters on a lot of college campuses. And did their parents actually go to this school too? Because if we're being honest, that still matters on a lot of college campuses. It's metrics like those that I would argue should be basic pieces of data that are utilized daily when counselors are trying to be proactive with their outreach. So those are just a few quick things, but I think the biggest thing, again, I would encourage listeners to do is figure out, do I know what's being sent by other people not named me within my department? to my students? And then B, do I understand either how to go in and where to look in my CRM, or what is the expectation in terms of how I'm supposed to prioritize within the different groups of students that I'm responsible for?
Yeah, I think, and you touched upon it, there's parents, there's this changing demographic, right? So we've been talking about Gen Z this whole time, but during the pandemic, for the first time ever in our history, we are actually marketing to 5 different generations. Now, obviously, your traditionalists, are in their late 70s, that kind of thing. But there are a lot of people who are taking care of their grandkids right now, and for whatever unfortunate reasons that are there. But baby boomers take things differently. Gen X likes to talk differently. Millennials are a whole different avenue, and then you got the Zoomers, and now you got there's a lot of different techniques and a lot of different ways to connect with people. But I think what you said is important. Have I made those connections not only with the student but with the parent as well? You have to ask yourself, how do you measure those interactions? Is it a one-off email, that kind of thing, or do you continue then to communicate with a parent or with a grandparent or an aunt, uncle, or whoever that person is using as their home base per se? But I think it's the other issue that you have is that not everybody is online. So people are still making phone calls. Some people are, now just getting into, I know my dad has found text messaging, and granted, he's, late 60s, early 70s, I think I'm gonna age him right here probably, but or give away how old I am. Let's just say he's young enough to know better. But he's texting a lot now, those kinds of things, and he's in our thread 2 or 3 times a day, sending us things that that he feels is important. But when you look at it, Jeremy, Gen Z and their parents, they could be all these different kinds of groups of people who communicate differently or want to know things differently too, right? So maybe the Gen Xers are looking at, well, I'm going to retire sooner than later. How much is cost going to really prevail in here, or safety and security, or whatever happens to be that piece? How do you suggest admissions counselors and those running those CRMs identify and adapt their recruitment approaches to align with some of these groups? What should they be doing? What should they be telling people?
Well, they, number one, need to understand that it's really hard to help someone or serve someone or communicate with someone the way they want to be helped, served, or communicated with if you don't, ask them what their preference is. And I'm not telling you, if you ask 100 people, 100 people are all going to give you an answer. Yeah, it's going to be a challenge to get a hold of some of them. But the good thing is there are literally dozens and dozens of surveys that are done by different companies inside and outside of higher ed every single year that show you, okay, here's what this generation is saying they would prefer to receive in the mail, or how often they want an email. And here are what parents are saying is important to them. And so a lot of the data is out there. Number one, it's understanding where to look for it, and a couple great resources. I mean, Niche is a great resource for those of you that, are familiar with Niche, NICHE. We partnered with them for a couple of years up until this past year. Will Patch is a friend of mine over there, and they do a great job every year of, for example, surveying different groups of students and different groups of parents at different stages of the college search process. And so it's number one, understanding, well, what does the data say? Or at worst, when I try to get a conversation going with somebody from Gen X or a Zoomer or a Boomer or a Millennial, whoever it is, I'll just ask them. Now, I can tell you, based on all the data we have and all the data we get through partnerships like the one we had previously with Niche, they're going to tell you email is their preferred method of communication, Chris, pretty much every generation. Now, do I think they default to that in some cases? 100%. Because as I explain, right, when I do trainings, Chris, email is, especially to a young person, email is a safe interaction. All right. They can open it whenever they want. The expectation isn't, even if you ask them to respond right away, that they have to, versus, for example, if they're face-to-face with you or on the phone, it's kind of very awkward if they don't say something in the moment, if you've prompted them with a question, for example. And so email, for example, is something you're going to do. But what I would tell you, we have learned at TCS, and I would tell you just in reading things from other companies who are surveying as well, almost every generation wants a balance of all these things. There's no generation that says, don't ever do A, B, and C, only do E, from every piece of data I've seen. Now, do certain generations prefer things? Yes. But like I'll tell you, for example, with the current generation of students, the seniors, for example, that many of you are recruiting who are listening. Yes, they love text messaging, and yes, they do it with their friends, just like my daughter does all the time. But we've been asking for 2.5 years on surveys, at what point were you comfortable with a college texting you in your college search? And only 25% of students are pretty much saying it was before I made the decision to apply to that school. Doesn't mean you can't text them at the inquiry stage, but I'm telling you that the large majority are like, I don't want to text from any college, no matter how interested I am in them, until either I've at worst applied and or been admitted. And so it's just understanding, okay, we're going to use text messaging, for example, but we might use it later in the process with certain groups, or earlier here, but email, for example, is one that I would argue you're going to use with all of them. And so staying current on trends, staying current on what does each population want and prefer is super important. And then also trying to figure out, Chris, like, what are the big pain points that each one of them is dealing with? Because to your point, a parent, has different pain points than their child. If we're being honest, young people, when they go to college, care about what? They want to know what they're going to do for fun. It's not that they don't value a degree in a lot of cases, and they're not concerned about like, well, how are you going to get me a real good paying job? Yes, they care about those things too. But they equally, I would argue, for the most part, care as much as where am I going to hang out? How am I going to meet friends? And like, what are some of the fun parts that I'm going to get to experience over the next 4 years? Versus, as we all know, parents are, is my child going to be safe? How much is it going to cost? And is it worth the investment we're going to make, or I'm going to make as a family member or parent, if I'm helping, support my child financially or support my family member financially with this decision? And so it's just understanding, well, what are the pain points and what do, again, different groups of people value? And as I said, the nice positive thing is you don't have to survey or run your own surveys to find that out, although that would be helpful in some cases, I would argue, for some people listening. You just have to know where to look online. And if anybody listening is like, Jeremy, I need help, where do I look online? I'll give you my email address at the end if Chris doesn't, and you're welcome to send me an email and I will point you in the right direction. But at the end of the day, like I said, Chris, it's understanding a couple of things. That regardless of which generation you're communicating with, every single one of them wants to be treated fairly, wants to be listened to, and wants to feel like you understand this process is about them and not necessarily about your school. I don't know a single human, it's the way we're all created, who isn't in some regard internally selfish, just because, again, this is how we're created. And so understanding that regardless of how you communicate, are you being empathetic? Do you sound like a human and not a robot? Are you trying to be helpful and not vomit information and learn about this other person and then give information based on, back to active listening, what you hear?
Yeah, I think that's important too, and, when you're thinking about, that personalization level, and the anxiety that happens throughout the year, throughout the recruitment cycle, and even with the FAFSA changes that are coming this year, with the delay in FAFSA coming in probably late December, from what I'm hearing from colleagues at the Department of Ed, that window that we typically would have to talk about value and make sure that parents understand the investment that's going to be made, which we would start talking about earlier and earlier. And then they would have numbers in front of them they could compare. Now it's going to be January, February now, before it's going to be like the old school days before prior year happened. And we're going to be in a situation where that stress level will come in a little bit too. But we don't have to do it alone. And I wanted to kind of talk real quickly about, collaboration across campus. It does take a village to recruit a student. And there's always, these different offices that admissions counselors and enrollment marketing folks should be leaning on to get more and additional information, like your marketing communications office, faculty and academic support services, student affairs, obviously. To your point, Jeremy, where's the fun going to happen? Where am I going to live? What's the food taste like? Those kinds of things. Athletics is a big deal for a lot of campuses, as marching band and esports kinds of things as well start to pop up on college campuses. And then one thing that we kind of forget about sometimes is student financial services, not just the financial aid, but how are you going to pay the bill? The bursar's office or the student accounts office. For many counselors, in their first time working, to your point, this is not their alma mater. So they might not know all of these different people on campus and these resources on campus to be able to tap into that. From your experience, Jeremy, how can admissions teams build those collaborative and collaborations with athletics and the academic side and support departments in a way that has a positive impact on their recruiting efforts?
By intentionally, and that's the biggest word I will emphasize, intentionally, making time to go sit and understand the worlds of different people on your campus. I see way too many people, Chris, that think they know what people do. I know what financial aid does. I know what the coaches do. If we're being honest, no, you really don't, right? Just like they don't understand what you do, if we're being honest, probably in admissions or enrollment marketing or whatever office. And so intentionally saying, if Chris works in athletics, right, and I work on the admission staff and I'm a counselor, hey, Chris, whenever I talk to student athletes, here are some things I hear, like any advice on like how you handle situations like that? Literally just going and trying to have some of these conversations and letting the other people in different departments who are key stakeholders know, I value your input. Even if I think I know, right, what you might do or how I might respond in a situation like that, I want to get your feedback just as a way, if nothing else, to confirm and let you know, hey, like I value your input. And so I'd love to hear what you have to say there. That needs to become common practice. The best schools, Chris, that I know do the best job every year. And by the best job, I mean, they make their class, they don't struggle as much as other schools do to hit a lot of their metrics. They will, for example, in real time, every single month, have meetings that include admissions, athletics, financial aid, and a couple other key stakeholder offices on campus, to where people from those offices, they don't get together once a year, twice a year, they get together every month. And they talk in real time about what's happening in each department, what the data is saying. That helps then all of these other departments feel like, okay, even if I'm not over in admissions or financial aid or with the coaches or with student success every day, I have an understanding of some of the things they're hearing as their staff is having conversations with current students, prospective students, parents. And I feel like because we've done cross-training, another super important thing to answer your question that you can do, I understand this is probably the most effective way to answer that question about financial aid, because I promise you, to your point, Chris, financial aid, there are going to be more questions than ever before this year. There's already a lot, but because of changes with the FAFSA, there's going to be even more. So counselors, I don't expect you to take all of those and come up with perfect situations and scenarios in terms of how you're going to answer it. But I expect you, if you want my advice, to go talk with your financial aid staff and say, hey, like, how are you planning on answering these type questions? I mean, just making sure that, okay, if that wasn't the way you were planning on doing something similarly, maybe that gives you something to think about. So spending time. And then I also think the other thing, Chris, is showing data. And the real quick example I'll give there is, I hear on a lot of campuses, hey, we want faculty to be more involved in things. Hey, we want them to be more involved in the visit. We want them to be more. And I think we all understand, sure, some faculty members will help and a lot won't for a whole host of reasons we don't need to get into. But what I have found is helpful is show them data as to why you're asking for their help. Because a lot of times they look and go, oh, you just don't want to do it over at admissions and you want to pawn it off on us. No, we want you to be involved, for example, in the campus visit, because students are telling us in surveys, I would love to be able to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody who, again, is a faculty member, the dean, whoever it is, of whatever department, of whatever academic program I'm interested in. Because back to feelings, it helps me feel like, okay, this could be some ways that I could be happy. That sounds like a learning environment I could enjoy. And so I think it's a combination of spending time with people, Chris, and showing them data and making them feel like, yes, you're asking for things, but you're not asking for things because you necessarily don't want to do the work. You're asking for them because you understand maybe we can offer valuable feedback. And if we're listening to you, then we feel like we're also getting something out of this too.
I think that's the important part is that, showing data, you don't have enough people in your program. Well, here's why, and or here's some ways that you can help build your program too, because a lot of times faculty are also charged with making sure that they have enough people to enroll in their programs too. So I think getting that buy-in from not just the faculty. I mean, it's the student affairs staff, those kinds of things too, where, it's an important piece to make that feeling, to make those connections, so that when the student arrives on campus, they've already got a connection with somebody other than you on campus, because you have gone on to the next 500 kids you're going to recruit. You're not going to be here all the time for them. So
everybody can make connections, right, Chris? You said the
right.
word.
Yeah, connections is what it's all about. So, self-care and professional development, and we're getting a little short on time here, but I think it's pretty self-evident right now. There's a lot of stress in admissions. It is, to your point, Jeremy, it is a sales job. I had a VP one time tell me, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with the analogy, but it's like being a used car salesman, except the car was built in 1856. How you bring that to life, and how you sell that, and how you project those images with your words and with your actions, and bring that to life for a prospective student is important. And for a lot of young people, that's tough. To your point, that teaching that empathy and that compassion, a lot of times there is compassion fatigue. You can only have so much compassion for so many people, and you obviously have your family, but you have this extended family every year. And I remember going on the road as an admissions counselor after my second and third year, happy that I was going on the road, because I really didn't have to talk to anybody really that much during the day until I got to the college fairs at night, because I could just unwind a little bit, kind of thing. No one goes to college to be an admissions counselor, Jeremy. I have not seen a curriculum out there that has that. But it is, again, one of the most demanding jobs for a college campus. And if you don't make numbers, a lot of times that's a problem. What can we do as a campus leader? What can our campus leaders do beyond higher salaries to build that resilience of staff, to have an effective, happy, if you want to use a simple term, happy team, that's not just, going through the motions on a day-to-day basis? Because I feel like right now is that time where there's some burnout that's happening on campuses. How do we avoid that?
I would say a handful of things. Number one, as a leader, you have to be clear on your expectations, and you have to be consistent with your leadership style. And I don't see enough of that, if I'm being honest, Chris,
right,
on enough campuses. I think you also have to understand, back to a point I made earlier, it's really hard to help any of your staff grow if you don't understand who he or she is and what he or she wants out of this job, and why they're even doing this job in the first place. And so spending time, if you directly manage people, now, if you're a VP listening to this and you have a AVP or a director, like a lot of schools do under that, fine, then this kind of more applies to them. And for you, it would apply more to then understanding, do you have enough time scheduled each week, each month with the people you directly manage? But Chris, one-on-ones have never been more important. And way too many times they're getting pushed on college campuses. Oh, I got busy. Oh, every time you push a one-on-one, if you're a leader, you send a message to your staff that meeting really isn't that important. And as a person who cares about development, which a lot of this generation, again, if you understand the generation that is predominantly coming into these admissions roles, which is somebody who, male, female, early 20s, a lot of them, again, want to feel like there is a path for them, or somebody is leading them towards something. And so if they don't feel like, oh, Jeremy always looks busy, I don't want to go bother him, because you haven't made clear, I don't care how busy I look, Chris, if you ever want to talk to me because something's important and on your mind, come bother me. That's my job as a leader, is I work for you. Because that to me is, back to leadership mantras. I truly believe leadership is you work for your staff or the people you manage, not the other way around. And so it's understanding I have to spend time with my staff. I have to get to know them, and then figure out what do they need from me if I'm going to help them grow. And then I would just encourage leaders, if you feel like you're doing a lot of that, how much better could your staff be if they understood data more, right? We've talked about that a couple of times today. And so getting your staff to understand how to leverage data is something that's not going to, minimize in importance over the next bunch of years. It's going to continue to grow.
Yeah, it's only going to get bigger. And I think, you make that good point about the one-on-ones. And a lot of times there's a lot of hiring that's going to happen right now, right? Over the next 45 days, a lot of hiring, and then go out on the road, and I'll catch you in November kind of situation, doing that reconnection when people come back in off the road, not just to hear about what happened and what you're hearing and those kinds of things, but to see how those people are doing personally. and to see what's driving them still. Cool. All right. As we kind of wrap up, our last question, we ask this every single time. It's the end of July, folks. We are probably anywhere from 17 to 18 days away from your students coming back to campus. How do you feel about your class? Are you ahead? Are you on target? Are you a little behind and you got some concerns, but you still think you can make it? But you're behind and looking for answers in all the right areas, or wrong areas, I guess would be the right question. So Jeremy, what are you hearing out there right now?
It's hit or miss on all of it, Chris. There's some people who well exceeded their goals last year, and even better, didn't have to, for example, increase their discount rate, and they've been able to keep their staff in check as well. And then there are other places who 75+% of their staff has turned over, or they greatly underperformed, right, for a whole host of reasons. And so for me, right, I think it's just trying to understand, control what you can control. Anybody listening to this, if you're a leader, you can control more. If you're an admissions counselor, right, like you control obviously a lot of things in your day-to-day. And so really trying to focus on doing the best job with whatever tools you do or don't have, I think is super important.
Okay, Emma, let's see the results. Well, kind of a good mix there. We're a little behind, but not dead in the water yet. But looks like everybody's more than 50% are well on their way. So that's great news, guys. I'm real happy for you. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it. Why don't you go ahead and give your contact information, and then we'll email it out as part of the link that we send out to everybody.
Absolutely. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, the easiest way is email. So it's my first name, Jeremy, at Dan Tudor, which is DANTUD as in dog, OR.com. That's the best way to get a hold of me. And if it takes me a day or two to get back, I'm pretty good about getting back to people quickly. Just understand it's because I am in the middle of we'll call it travel season right now, as I travel around all these different campuses and try to serve and help them continue to grow their staff.
Appreciate you, Jeremy. Thanks again. And like I said, we'll put all that stuff out in the email that we send out to everybody later today too. Cool.
Appreciate the opportunity, Chris.
Take good care, buddy. Safe travels. So Jeremy Tears, everybody, and thanks again. So there's Thursday's takeaways. We'll just get through those pretty quickly. Again, empower your admission staff. Empowerment includes providing them with the tools and the resources they need to be successful in the job. Build those strong relationships with your team so that they can build those strong relationships with their staff, or with their prospective students, and other stakeholders on campus. 2, adapt to what is happening now and anticipate the future. That changing landscape in admissions and enrollment management is changing all the time. How you interact with families is changing all the time right now, and it's a different dynamic out there. But just take a deep breath and know and understand that you need to do the research behind it. And a great point that Jeremy made is asking, how do you want to be communicated with? And it'll change throughout the year. So you might want to check in with your prospective students more than once. And finally, prioritize the development and self-care. Let your teams find that flexibility. Let your teams do what they do best. If they are motivated and you show compassion and empathy toward them, that will turn around and show empathy and compassion toward your prospective students at the same time. It'll reduce turnover and help promote that long-term enrollment success that we all need to have as we're moving forward. So as we wrap up today, I'm going to let you know that our next Capture Cast will be on Thursday, August the 31st at 2 o'clock. And it's really developed for those who are new or who want to hear a little bit more about tips for navigating post-census conversations with campus leadership. We have some great resources that are going to be on the website very soon for you to take advantage of if you're a VP or director and you're having to meet with your president or your board of trustees or some local leaders about the enrollment that's happening and the enrollment dynamic that is happening out there right now. So we're gonna have a great conversation next month about that. We hope to see you register for that. Other than that, thank you for joining us today. Well, we'll see you very soon, and take great care.